Okay, let's continue talking about the World Trade Organization. When we left off, I think we were on this page here. These are the four major treaties that are administered by the World Trade Organization. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, General Agreement on Trade and Services, TRIPS, which relates to intellectual property, and the Dispute Settlement Understanding, which establishes how the WTO sets up like a judicial type process within the WTO. Just real quickly, I wanted to talk about the organizational structure, page 155. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but kind of like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization has set up a formal structure, and it's broken down, first of all, at the very highest level is what's called the Ministerial Conference, which is kind of equivalent to the General Assembly in the United Nations, or Congress, sort of. Every WTO member nation, there are 163 members, have a delegate, a minister that is stationed in Geneva, and will act as a delegate and vote on behalf of the member country. From there down, there are different councils that are in place. There's the General Council, which also functions as the World Trade Organization dispute settlement body, which is essentially at the end of a dispute, once it makes its way through the WTO system, and we'll talk more about how that works later, but essentially it goes eventually to the dispute settlement body, which is the whole ministerial conference, all of the members, for final approval of any outcome in a dispute. And so they're like the ultimate, kind of like the Supreme Court, sort of the WTO, only it's not really structured that way. But basically, it's the whole ministerial conference will adopt or not adopt, depending on how it turns out, the final decision that comes out of the dispute system. And I'll talk more about that later. The General Council also functions as what's called the Trade Policy Review Body, and basically that is when they meet to discuss treaties involving international trade and any changes that are going to be made. And remember, I talked about this last time, but I want to reiterate again, all of the decisions, well, there's a few procedural things, but anything that's of substance involving how trade law will be changed or modified or new rules that are adopted has to be agreed upon by a unanimous vote of all 163 members. So it's all done through a lot of negotiation and discussion because everybody has to agree to it or it doesn't pass. And then down below that, there are various different councils which represent each of the treaties involving international trade in goods. That's the GATT Council. And their job is to administer the various provisions of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And they're within that council, they have different subgroups involving like agriculture or fisheries or shipping. So they have different like subcommittees, so to speak. Council for Trade and Services, which administers the GATS Treaty, General Agreement on Trade and Services. And finally, the TRIPS Council, which administers the intellectual property portion of the WTO. And these are generally different people. You know, each country is going to have representation, but they're generally going to be a different person than the person that sits on the Ministerial Council. It's like they've got one they're starting to develop on cryptocurrency. And so they have somebody that's kind of a specialist in cryptocurrency, but they don't vote on anything else. It's only related to those kind of things. And then there's the Secretariat, which is the administrative part of the WTO, which is headed by the Director General, which would be equivalent to the Secretary General at the UN. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just want you to be aware of the main organizational, you know, they broke it down into various different functions. We're not going to get into how they do things too detailed because I want to focus more on how the treaties, GATT especially, work. So I'm going to go back a page now, and let's start talking about the main treaty of the World Trade Organization, which is the, oh, I forgot to talk about, where'd it go? That's all right, we'll come back to that. Okay, so the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT, again, historically was established in 1947, post-World War II. And then over the course of the decades that followed World War II, there were a number of different what are called rounds, which are large conventions attended by numerous different countries, where the GATT was modified and then modified again and again and again. And so there are layers and layers and layers of treaties and modifications to the treaties, eventually leading to the creation of the WTO itself as a permanent organization in 1995. Prior to 1995, it was left up to the countries to really negotiate and administer things on their own, and it just became really not workable, and that was the whole point of creating a permanent organization. So let's look at the main principles or ideas behind GATT. And remember, this is post-World War II as modified up through today. So first of all, one of the primary goals of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is the principle of what's called non-discrimination. And this is the idea, in a basic nutshell, that when you become a member of the World Trade Organization, there are obligations and there are also benefits. And one of the obligations is countries that join the WTO agree to harmonize their laws so that laws on import and export of goods essentially are going to be the same from one country to the next for all WTO members. And the idea behind that is by having the same laws, it makes international trade smoother, more efficient, easier, and can help move goods around the world in a better way. It takes down barriers and that kind of thing. As part of that, one of the benefits is when you join the WTO, you are agreeing that you will not discriminate against imported goods. And the idea being that once they have entered your country, they go through customs, and at customs, they're going to be subject to a tax, which is called a tariff, and other type of requirements such as inspections, engineering standards, environmental standards, basic things like that. Once they clear customs and the goods are brought into your country, then they have to be treated the same as domestic goods. So this is a main function of GATT. Along with that is the idea of what's called the national treatment rule and most favored nation status. And this is, I think I have this here somewhere, on page 157. So the most favored nation rule, which is now called normalized trade relations, this is a rule that basically says that a WTO member must apply its tariff rules equally to other members. So what that means is if you, let's say we set up a tax for the importation of ballpoint pens into the United States. We establish, let's say, a 10-cent per pen tax. And the idea being that if you're a WTO member, you are going to have the benefit of that same tax rate applying to all other WTO members. And so the idea being that you're not going to discriminate from one country to the next. Now, where this all came about, and one of the problems historically, has been that depending on who is in power at the time, the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the UK or whatever, they would utilize import laws as a political tool. The idea being that perhaps I'm the President of the United States and there's a country that I'm not really happy about what they're doing, and I want them to maybe change their policy. And so I would tell the country, if you don't change your policy, we are going to tax your goods that come into the United States at 300% of their value. Just a huge tax. And that puts pressure on another country politically to modify their policy, whatever it may be. And that was used as a political tool by presidents and other chiefs of state around the world. And the problem with that is the political landscape, changes. And so you have maybe a president that doesn't like one particular country for whatever reason, and so they impose a huge tax on that country, and then you have a change in political power, and it's lifted. And then it goes back again, and then it's lifted again. And so you have this inconsistency over time, and it was also very much political. And so that was an interference to trade, efficient movement of goods and services for that matter. And so that's one of the ideas behind the WTO is let's get away from this idea of using import and export laws as a political tool. And let's allow countries to have the benefit of joining the WTO, and as part of that benefit, they're going to be treated the same. That way we're not giving preference to one country over another. And so that's a benefit of the WTO system, is doing away with a lot of that behind the scenes, closed door political maneuvering that historically has led to trade wars. And when we talk about a trade war, we're talking about the idea of countries that use import and export laws, again, politically, to hurt each other. Maybe imposition of taxes, or at some point, and I remember back in the 70s, we had this all the time, we had embargoes, where basically, the one I remember the most were Japanese automobiles. And essentially they were prohibited, or there were quotas put on the number of imported vehicles that could come into the United States. Now the idea behind that at the time was to try to protect the American automobile industry, but it didn't really work. And so it was a political tool. And take away the idea of using embargoes. An embargo is a flat out prohibition of importing goods from a certain country. So just say you can't bring any goods from this country into the US. Or if you can, maybe it's certain kind of goods, but not other kinds of goods. And again, that was used as a political tool. So this is one of the main principles behind the World Trade Organization, is to normalize, harmonize, get rid of that politicalization of international trade. Also, along with that is the idea that countries should not engage in what is called dumping. This word right here, dumping. Dumping is when a country floods another country with goods, so like television sets, for example, and with the intent of destroying the internal manufacturing capability within another country. And it's kind of monopolization. And so goods would be flooded into a country, typically sold at below manufacturing value for a period of time, so that the domestic companies essentially can't compete. And then that destroys the domestic manufacturing base for those type of products. And then once that manufacturing base has been destroyed, the countries that were dumping those products raise their prices because there's no other source. And we've seen that over the years in the electronics industries and other industries here in the US and then throughout the world, that we just simply don't have those manufacturing capabilities anymore. And part of that came out of dumping, which went on quite extensively in the 70s and 80s for certain products, especially electronics. The other issue with the WTO is subsidization. This is where a government subsidizes certain industries or areas of their economy to help give competitive advantage to goods that are exported. And essentially they're propping up, like for example, subsidies may have been given to television and other electronics makers by countries that were dumping into the United States, because they want to destroy that economy. So the WTO rules also limit the ability of governments to subsidize and prop up certain industries if the intent of the subsidy is to harm manufacturing or other activity in other countries. Now, some subsidies are still perfectly fine. We're not going to get into all that. They have red, green, and yellow subsidies, and it gets to be very complicated. But that's one of the goals behind the WTO, is to prohibit that. It also allows countries to file a dispute if they believe a country is improperly dumping goods or improperly subsidizing a particular industry. Boeing-Airbus dispute has been going on for years in the WTO, and that all has to do with subsidization by the European Union of Airbus, and to a degree Boeing within the US. So those kind of things. So when we talk about most favored nation rule, this is the idea that if you're a WTO member, you are going to enjoy the benefit of being treated the same as other WTO members. Now, with that said, the WTO still allows for customs unions. Remember, that's where countries agree to have the same tax rate, and free trade areas. A free trade area is a group of countries that have established reduced or no barriers for movement of goods or services within their countries. And there are a lot of these around the world. We have the Central American Free Trade Agreement, US, Canada, Mexico Free Trade Agreement, formerly known as NAFTA. And there are these type of free trade areas all throughout the world involving a number of different geographical groups. Caribbean has a free trade area within the Caribbean system. And obviously the European Union is a giant free trade area if you're in the EU itself. So those are still acceptable. The United States has a number of free trade agreement treaties bilateral, like with Jordan, for example. So you can trade most goods free without paying a tax into the country of Jordan and vice versa. We'll look at those later in the course. But those are still allowed, and I'll show you how that plays out in a minute when we look at the tax tables. So those free trade areas are still acceptable under WTO rules as long as they're not being used in a way that violates dumping and subsidization and other standards. Okay, so when we talk about most favored nation rule, going back to this page, that's one of the fundamental components of the non-discrimination. That is, you're going to treat WTO members the same so long as they're in good standing. So you're not going to have this patchwork of different rules and laws that apply to different countries. I mean, at one time we had, I don't know how many, but we had maybe 30 different rules depending on which country a good's coming from. And those would change all the time depending on the political system. Not very transparent, very difficult to work with. Another primary goal of GATT is to what's called eliminate non-tariff trade barriers. That's a term I want you to know. Non-tariff trade barrier. So a trade barrier, let me find the page. So this is on page 159. So when we talk about a trade barrier is any law that has the effect of creating a barrier or anything that limits the free flow of goods between countries at the border. Now, these kind of barriers may be, as I talked about before, a quota, which is a maximum number of a certain type of product that can be imported in a given year, and quotas were often used, again, politically. Trade bans, which we still have some, like to a degree with Cuba. We have trade embargoes, where you flat out prohibit all trade with countries. And again, these were things that were used as a political tool, but they're a barrier to trade. They either limit or prohibit the importation of goods. So the goal of the WTO in harmonizing these rules is the idea that WTO members will not engage in quotas, trade bans, and embargoes. That's part of your responsibility when you join the WTO as a member country, is you're not going to impose these barriers, but instead the goal is that the only major barrier to goods entering into a WTO member country will be a tax, a tariff. So that's the goal of the WTO, is to reduce down trade barriers, hopefully to the point where the only barrier to entry of goods, with some exceptions, is going to be the imposition of a tax. So if I have a ballpoint pen manufactured in the US and a ballpoint pen manufactured in France, when I bring that ballpoint pen into the US, we pay a tax at the border. Once the ballpoint pen clears customs, it's now in the United States itself. It's treated exactly the same as a pen made here in the US. You don't discriminate against imported goods in terms of, when I say discriminate, imposing taxes, imposing different engineering standards, imposing different environmental standards, or other laws that treat imported goods differently. And we'll come back to that point in a minute. So these are various different types of trade barriers. Inspections and engineering standards is another way that imported goods, from a political standpoint, are barriers to trade. And this is the idea that sometimes, as a political tool, there would be, we're not going to prohibit goods coming in, but we're going to make it so difficult to pass through customs in terms of having inspections, another inspection, an inspection of an inspection, and then a review. We may have engineering standards that we set so high for certain countries, not because we want those engineering standards really to apply, but we basically are doing it as a backdoor trade embargo or quota. So we may say, all right, for any cell phones that are produced from a certain country, we're going to have engineering standards that are so difficult to meet that it's just not cost effective for that country to import goods into the US. Whereas the very same cell phone, if it's produced domestically, those type of inspections or engineering standards don't apply. So we're treating goods differently, not for a legitimate purpose, like a safety standard, but as a backdoor trade barrier. Does that make sense? So, and again, these are things that were used politically, and it formed, or it created a reduction in the ability for free movement of goods. So those type of engineering standards, environmental standards, other kind of standards that are, in theory, with good intention, but they're being applied differently to imported goods versus domestically produced goods, are prohibited. It's okay to have engineering standards under the WTO rules, and that's a good idea. Fire and safety rules, lithium batteries, all the different things that we have, but you've got to have those rules apply the same to imported goods and domestic goods. You can't have different rules for each. That's one of the ideas behind the WTO. You also have to publish those rules so they're transparent and can be researched. Customs regulations, that may include, again, as a trade barrier, using customs regulations as another backdoor quota method. And what I mean by that is you may have different rules depending on what country, what they have to do to get their goods in, that you don't apply to other countries. And there's no legitimate reason for that. It's simply as a political punishment, so to speak. You may also have a situation where you just don't staff the customs. So you've got a shipment of goods coming in and there's nobody there to do the inspection. Maybe it's a shipment of bananas. And the bananas go bad because they can't be inspected to be brought in. Not from a legitimate standpoint where you just don't have staff, but you're doing it on purpose. This is the idea behind the WTO, is to get away from the politicalization of using customs regulations. Talk talked about that, port delays and bureaucracy. Currency restrictions are another type of a trade barrier. A currency restriction what I mean by that is tariffs may only be paid in maybe US dollars and no other type of currency, or you may prohibit or have a higher exchange rate or discount rate that you give to certain currencies above and beyond what the normal exchange rate would be. And again, that can be as a form of a trade barrier used politically. So again, that's this non-discrimination idea. Licensing, import, and export of goods that are not otherwise restricted, like firearms or nuclear products, antiquities or archaeological products, those can be banned. That's still fine under the WTO rules. But requiring onerous licensing or different type of import licensing from one country to the next is another form of a trade barrier. And again, it's okay to require licenses, but you have to apply licensing rules, permits, however you want to phrase it, the same to all WTO member countries. You can't have different standards for different countries in terms of licensing and permitting, with some exceptions. So at the end of the day, what I'm leading up to is this idea that the ultimate goal of the WTO is to reduce and minimize any kind of a trade barrier other than a tariff. The idea being that you pay the tax, and once you pay the tax, that's it. You can bring your goods in. As long as you're from a WTO member, you pay the tax, the goods come in the country. And that, that's an easy way to measure things, and it's also an easy way to stay away from the politicalization of cross-border importation and exportation of goods. So the idea is tariff as the only trade barrier as much as possible. Now there are exceptions. So the slide right above there on page 159. So there are still exceptions to this under the WTO rules. Countries that had preferences in terms of other countries that were there prior to the WTO could remain. If a state has preferential treatment for procurement or buying of goods for government purposes, we see these rules commonly. We have them in the United States where a lot of places for a public contract, like if you're going to build a university building, we have rules that require certain types of goods be made domestically. And those type of rules are still fine for government procurement. Same thing with military. You can require military products to only come from a domestic producer. And member states can discriminate in favor of movies. I think there's another page on this too. Hold on. Page 164, sorry, I had to jump around there. So again, we're talking about trade barriers. WTO generally is going to prohibit embargoes or those kind of things, but there are some exceptions I want you to be aware of that are still permissible under WTO rules. So a country can have laws that prohibit importation of certain goods to protect public morals, the way it's phrased under WTO rule. So that, for example, you might have a country that for cultural or religious purposes doesn't allow maybe alcohol, and so you could still have those type of laws, but they have to be applied uniformly. So you can't say, if you're a WTO member, we're going to prohibit the importation of alcoholic beverages only from this group of countries, but we'll allow it from that group of countries. That's discriminatory rulemaking. You can discriminate, or you can say no alcohol from any country, that's fine, but you can't pick and choose. Again, taking away the politicalization. You can have laws that limit the importation or exportation as may be necessary for environmental, health, and safety purposes, so human, animal, or plant life or health. So we may have back when we had bovine spongiform encephalitis, mad cow disease. I don't know if you guys ever heard of that before, but it's a disease that affects beef cattle, and it makes their meat essentially unsafe to eat, and it causes health problems in Crutchfield's disease. So bans were put on the exportation and importation of cattle for purposes of limiting the spread of mad cow disease. Fine. But you've got to apply those same rules to countries the same. You can't just say, well, you can, for that case, it's not the best example because you could still allow importation of cattle from countries that didn't have it, but you get the idea. So we can't say we're not going to allow certain products from one country and allow the same type of product from another country unless there's a public health reason or something of that nature. You got to apply the rules the same. You can have laws that reduce or limit importation or exportation of gold, silver, down below. You can also have laws that restrict importation of prison labor products, national treasures, archaeological, artistic, historic value. You can have laws that relate to conservation of natural resources. Again, they have to be applied uniformly. That's the whole point of the WTO non-discrimination. Or if there's a short supply situation, you can have a temporary rule to limit import or export of goods to remedy that supply chain problem. So at the end of the day, the point we're making is that the idea of the WTO is when you become a member, one of the benefits is you're going to be treated the same as other members. You're not going to be discriminated against on your goods. So that's one of the benefits of the WTO. Okay, so under GATT, we're going to treat, we can have rules, but we're going to treat all WTO members the same, unless they're part of a free trade area. We're going to try to eliminate barriers to trade other than the payment of taxes, and we're going to allow equal access to markets, meaning we're not going to give preferential treatment for a product to one country over another country within the WTO membership. All WTO members will have equal access to other members. Again, the idea to take away the politicalization of allowing or prohibiting products from certain countries because they're within your political sphere or outside of your political sphere. Transparency is another major goal of the WTO, and this is sort of similar to what we saw with the United Nations, where you have to file the treaty with the UN if you want to be able to enforce the treaty through the United Nations system. Same idea with the WTO. WTO members are required to publish their rules and make them available. Now with the internet you can just look them up. Where before the rules oftentimes were not published, or they may be changed on a whim, and then that essentially would treat countries differently that didn't have the ability to be able to research what your importation laws are. So that's another goal of the WTO. Simplification, which goes along with that. And then finally, to set up a dispute settlement system so that countries that feel that another WTO member is violating these WTO rules, rather than engage in a trade war between them, it sets up a system where the country that is aggrieved can go to the WTO and initiate a dispute, a case against the other country, and then it will be determined by the membership of the WTO through that process whether or not a country is violating WTO rules. So again, sets up that dispute system. Okay, so let's talk about what I mean when I say tariff. Here it is right here. Okay, page 161. So this leads to what we call the harmonized tariff system. Harmonized meaning the same, right? You're in harmony. Tariff meaning taxes. So as part of this whole process, we have established, let me show you how this works here. I'm going to pull my computer up. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is known as the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, which is put out by the U.S. Department of Commerce. And this is essentially tax rates for goods that are going to be imported into the U.S. And this is what I mean when I say transparency. This is where we can go look to find out what the tax rates are. It's a big, giant file. And all WTO member countries are required to do something similar, to have a tariff schedule that is published so that it can be reviewed. So let me just show you how this works. So it's broken down by various products, so I'm just going to start here under section 1, meat and edible meat offal. So let me open that up real quick. Let me show you how this works. Okay, so let's say I want to import meat of bovine animals, hamburger, right, into the United States. So we have 3 different columns here. The first column is the general column. The second column is a special column. And then the third column is for everybody else. So the first column here imposes a 4.4 cent tax per kilogram on imported beef into the United States. That column applies to WTO members. All WTO members then are going to be subject to that 4.4% tariff, and we're going to apply that equally to all WTO members. The special column is free trade areas. So this is what would apply if you're importing beef from one of the countries that the United States has a free trade agreement with. So for example, Australia, Jordan, other countries within the free trade areas, and again, we're going to look at those in more detail later in the term. Free, there's no tax. So if we're importing from a country within one of our free trade areas, no tax. So this is the WTO column, the first one, under general. This is the free trade column, meaning it's free. And then column number 2 over there, the last one, you see here it's 13.2 cents per kilogram. So it's a much higher tax rate. That is the tax rate if you're importing goods from a non-WTO member. So there's a benefit in becoming a WTO member in having that reduced tax rate, for one thing, and then also knowing that other non-WTO members are going to have to pay a higher tax rate. So if you're doing importing into the U.S., this is where you're going to go look to find out what tax rate you'll pay. And like I say, it's very detailed. It's virtually every product you can possibly think of has a tax rate. And you look up your tax rate, and that's what you would pay when you go through customs. So, same thing, if I'm going to be exporting beef into other countries, I'm going to go look up their version of this tax schedule. Now, they don't have to have the same tax that the U.S. imposes. They can come up with whatever tax they want, but it has to be applied equally to all WTO members. So if France wanted to impose $1 or €1 per kilogram, they could do that, but then they have to apply it to all WTO members the same. So it's not requiring you to have the same tax rate, but once you establish that tax rate, all WTO members get the same treatment. That's the basic idea. Now again, what's the point? The point is to help encourage and streamline international importation and exportation of goods. Helps economies, helps grow lesser developed countries when they have the ability to export goods and import goods at a cheaper rate. And so that's the idea behind all of these harmonization rules that we see with the WTO. All right. So let's talk about the WTO dispute system. So again, this is the fourth treaty that's administered by the WTO. The Dispute Settlement Understanding is the formal name for the treaty. And what this treaty does, it establishes a process within the WTO for a country that believes another WTO member is not following the rules. They can lodge a complaint, and then there's a formalized process that is established. And page 171 is where I'm going, right here. So basically it works like this. The WTO first will require a country or a group of countries that feels another country has imposed rules that violate WTO requirements to engage in informal discussions, which are done, again, that's why you have a permanent organization. You have ministers that can meet in Geneva, Switzerland, and try to work out the dispute among themselves. That is encouraged. Most disputes, imagine, are resolved that way. I don't know any statistics on it. But if that does not work, then a country can file a request for a formal consultation. And this is essentially the initial start of the formal process. And so essentially a complaint is lodged with the WTO. The country that is accused of violating rules is formally notified by the WTO staff. And then they are required, the countries that are part of the dispute, are required to engage in structured discussions called consultations. They have to. They can't just blow it off, so to speak. That establishes a 60-day timeline. Those consultations must occur within 60 days of the complaint being lodged. That can be extended by the parties to the dispute if they want to extend the 60 days. And that process will go on for that period of time. Assuming they cannot work out a deal, solve the problem, then the next step is what's called a panel. A panel is a 3-person panel that will act as judges. And you'll have what we would call here in the United States a form of an arbitration, where each party country to the dispute will present their side of the case to the panel. The panel will then make a decision about whether or not a particular rule or law that is subject of the dispute violates WTO rules or not, and it will also make a decision about what remedy or what steps the offending country has to do to fix the problem. So from there, you can appeal the panel decision. The panel has to issue, it's a 90-day process. So it establishes this 90-day process. Again, that can be extended by mutual agreement, but if they don't agree, it's got to be done within 90 days. From there, the country that loses basically can appeal to an appellate panel, and that process takes anywhere from 30 to 90 days depending on the type of case. And from there, the decision goes to the dispute settlement body. And again, the dispute settlement body is one of the organs of the WTO structure that we looked at earlier. And it's essentially all of the WTO members. And the way that it works is the decision after the panel will automatically be implemented unless there is unanimous consent to not adopt the decision. So all of the WTO members basically have to agree to withdraw the decision, and if they don't all agree, then it's implemented. So all of the WTO, at the end of the day, are involved in these disputes by essentially agreeing to the outcome. That process takes 60 days. And then from there, you'd have implementation of whatever penalties there might be. A penalty might be a fine. It might be other countries allowing to engage in higher tariff against the offending country, where otherwise it would violate that tariff schedule. So if you've got a country that's violating WTO rules, one of the penalties may be that other WTO member countries will impose a higher tax on those goods. Or it could allow for a period of time for the offending country to change their laws before the penalties kick in, things like that. Now, it's actually a lot more detailed than this. I broke it down into these basic steps. Primarily what I want you to know, I'm not so concerned, you know, how many days for this or that. I want you to understand that that's part of the function of the WTO is to establish this whole process. It's very important because, again, prior to the WTO, a country that had a dispute with another country, they had to try to work it out themselves. There was no formal structure on how that would take place. So this establishes this formalized process that didn't exist before. And now all the WTO member countries know what to do when there is a dispute. And they know that if they can't work out through informal discussions, negotiations with the country, then they can refer back to the WTO system, and it's going to be implemented and follow through this process all the way down to the whole ministerial council at some point. So that's kind of the big component of this that's sort of behind the scenes, or you don't really think about, is having that system and structure in place. Everybody knows what the rules are. Everybody knows what the timelines are. Everybody knows what to do in the event of a dispute instead of having to figure it out as you go, that kind of thing. Now, there have been a number of disputes lodged with the WTO over the years. You can go look it up on their website. But this is that basic process I want you to be aware of. So when I talk about the dispute settlement process, this is what I'm referring to. Informal discussions, consultations, a panel is established, and then eventually it's adopted. An appeal is possible, and eventually it's adopted by all of the WTO members. And again, unanimous consent would apply only if they don't want to adopt it. Otherwise, it's automatically done. So I have a little video here I'm going to watch that is a case study on how the WTO process works. Page 175 is a narrative, but I'll just explain to you so you don't have to read all that. Okay, so what this whole dispute is about, back in the mid-90s, this is right when the WTO first was established in 1995. So this is one of the first disputes that worked its way through the system. That's why it's important. So basically, this dispute involves the United States and Venezuela and other countries involving oil and petroleum products. And the United States at the time had imposed, through the Environmental Protection Agency, rules on importation of petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel, etc., environmental standards for things like how much sulfur content there could be, what kind of detergents, what kind of other particulate requirements for petroleum that applied to imported petroleum products but did not apply to domestic products. So these are environmental standards that are treating imported goods differently, in this case petroleum products, differently than US produced petroleum. Now the idea behind environmental standards, of course, is a good idea, but the argument and what started this whole dispute was the US is not imposing those same environmental standards, much stricter standards on imported petroleum products, which makes it more expensive for those countries because they have to meet these higher standards in terms of refining and that kind of thing. So the argument that forms the basis of this is essentially the idea that if you're going to have this standard, you know, to protect the environment, that's a good thing, but why is it different for the very same product for imported goods versus US goods? Unless it's being used to make it more expensive for those countries to import into the US, and thus it's a backdoor form of a trade barrier. Okay, so that's the backdrop to all this. So hopefully this will work here. Oop. Wait a minute.
Good evening.
It's not my video.
Let me extend my welcome to all the attendees, WTO members.
Here we go.
In 1994, the United States government adopted a regulation mandating specific standards for the quality of the gasoline sold in the United States. The aim was to protect the environment. Oil-producing countries, in particular Venezuela and Brazil, protested. They said that this regulation was unfair. The case was critically important for Venezuela.
2/3 of Venezuela's gasoline exports were concentrated on the US market.
The case created tension and controversy. It drew in the industry, trade specialists, and environmentalists.
The political context was rather harsh.
The solution was not an easy one, but at the end, almost everyone was satisfied. The case was resolved in the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
That's the WTO headquarters in
How
Geneva.
potentially damaging trade quarrels can end in harmony in the WTO. Confidence and trust are essential to human relationships. Societies and civilization are built in them. In international trade, too, confidence is the key. Confidence in what is negotiated, agreed, and signed. Governments have created in the World Trade Organization rules to govern international trade. Those rules have been ratified by members' parliaments which represent their people. But sometimes disputes arise over the implementation or the interpretation of the rules. This is not just quibbling over legalities. Economic prosperity, including people's jobs, are at stake. If governments can't solve their disputes on their own, they come to the WTO, which has a unique system to help them settle their differences.
Now those disputes are not based on power relation, but are rule-based, and this is immensely different.
The dispute settlement is an essential pillar of the WTO. It is a means for conciliation rather than just making judgments. Several recent high-profile cases have underscored the increasingly complex and politically charged nature of trade disputes. Uruguay round, one of the most ambitious international trade negotiations, came to an end. One of its achievements was to create a more effective means of settling trade quarrels.
During the Uruguay round, the dispute settlement system was improved very substantially. It was given a high degree of automaticity, which it did not have before. And we all know that justice not only must be right, but it must also be prompt.
The Uruguay round also led to international rules in new areas, such as trade in services and protection of intellectual property rights. Old disciplines were reinforced and markets further opened up. The success of these negotiations led to the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. It replaced the GATT.
Many countries had said we will agree to open up our markets further. Yes, we're quite prepared to do that, and we want other people to do the same, but only on condition that there was an effective body set up, an effective dispute settlement mechanism. I think we have that now in the WTO.
Disputes in the WTO are among governments. When a member government believes that another has violated WTO trade rules or has acted in a way that deprives business of their trading benefits, it can lodge a complaint with the WTO. The case is handled by the Dispute Settlement Body, commonly known as the DSB, which consists of high-level representatives of all WTO member governments. The parties to a dispute first consult with each other to seek a solution. If these consultations fail to resolve the dispute within 60 days, the complaining party may request the DSB to appoint a panel of independent experts to examine the case. The examination by the panel results in a ruling set out in the panel report. The parties can appeal the panel's ruling before the appellate body. The DSB adopts the panel report and the appellate body report if the case is appealed. Where a violation of a WTO rule is found, the DSB recommends that the defending party brings its trade measure into conformity with WTO law. If it fails to do so, the DSB can authorize trade sanctions at the request of the complaining party. The WTO dispute settlement system is faster and more effective than the previous GATT system. Faster because it sets rigorous time limits for resolving a dispute. It normally takes 1 year from the time the dispute settlement body receives the complaint up to the ruling of the panel, or 15 months if the case is appealed. This is far less time than it often takes to settle commercial litigation at a national level.
Now what you're saying is that in many cases, the filing of a complaint leads to early settlement and tangible results for countries, for companies, for workers, at an early point without the need to go through full litigation.
The new system is more effective because it is more automatic, with reports adopted unless there is a consensus to the contrary.
The losing party cannot prevent adoption of a panel report. Therefore, the credibility of the system, I must say, has enhanced considerably. The automaticity of the dispute settlement system is something which is in the interest of smaller players in the WTO.
In addition, the new system has more teeth when it comes to enforcing the rulings.
Well, the most significant difference is that there are effective sanctions. In the GATT, if at the end of the day you didn't like the result, you didn't have to abide by it, and anything to do much about it. Now, there's, I believe, a rather sophisticated and subtle system which enforces the results.
The system prohibits governments from taking the law into their own hands and acting unilaterally.
Our primary objective in the Uruguay round in this specific field was to establish a mechanism under which no unilateral measure is to be permitted as a means of solving trade disputes. And from what we observed in the past several years, I think this provision has been observed in good faith in the majority of the cases.
The first case settled at the World Trade Organization involved a dispute between the United States and several other countries. In February 1994, the United States government adopted a regulation imposing certain conditions on the quality of the gasoline sold in the United States. The aim of this regulation, established by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, under the Clean Air Act, was to improve the air quality by reducing pollution caused by gasoline emissions. The regulation set different standards for domestic and imported gasolines. It was challenged before the WTO by Venezuela and later by Brazil.
Una violación del principio de trato nacional del artículo.
There is a violation of the principle of national treatment in Article 3, which says that imported goods, in this case the gasoline, once they are on the domestic market of a member country, in this case the United States, can't receive treatment less favorable than internally produced gasoline. We argued that Venezuelan gasoline, and in general imported gasoline, was being submitted to controls and standards much more rigorous than those imposed on gasoline produced in the United States.
The United States argued that this discrimination was justified under Article 20 of the GATT. This provision says that, under certain conditions, countries can take measures that would be normally outlawed in order to conserve exhaustible natural resources or to protect human, animal or plant life or health. One of the major conditions is that these measures should not be protectionism in disguise. Venezuela refuted that argument.
Venezuela was in no way questioning the right of the United States to impose very high environmental standards. But we said that if the United States wanted very clean gasoline, they should have submitted both the domestic and the imported gasolines to the same high standards.
The new regulation put in place by the United States had an important economic impact for Venezuela and for the state-owned gasoline producer Petróleos de Venezuela.
Producing the gasoline requested by the United States was much more expensive for Venezuela than if it could have followed the same specifications as domestic gasoline. In total, for the first 3 years, that represents some $40 million.
The US market was critically important for Venezuela and its export earnings.
Approximately 2/3 of Venezuelan exports are concentrated on the US market, so whatever is happening in that country on the commercial side is critically important for us. When Petróleos de Venezuela understood that the discriminatory aspects of the American gasoline regime would not be modified by the United States, it decided to consult the government to assess the possibility of bringing the case to the WTO. It was worthwhile. The process was initiated, and the permanent mission of Venezuela in Geneva asked for formal consultations with the delegation of the United States.